The first paradigm being as an active CISO, head of enterprise architecture, um, in various industries, and actually having been involved in multiple cyber breaches from that side, even before cyber breaches actually became anything. I mean, we were working with this behind the scenes in defense contracting, in telecom industry, during military conflicts, as well as corporate and government espionage. On the other side, on the other paradigm, I was actually had the opportunity. I actually had the opportunity to work with several cyber companies, and my own included, in which we actually perform incident response, cybersecurity posture assessments, and a lot of technical audits. So I saw it from that side, coming in, not from being part of the woodwork within the organization, but also as being part of a third party auditor, seeing things from a third party perspective, and leading forensics teams and being an incident handler, looking at it again from that perspective. And the final paradigm is I have been hired as an expert to come in and testify for some of the world's largest data breaches, such as Equifax, Yahoo, Facebook, various healthcare organizations, Ukrainian power grid breach, you name it. I have spoken and tried to educate and inform legislators, to CEOs, to boards, to federal and district judges, in one case, even writing declarations and working with the Supreme Court. So all three of those come together in this presentation. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. So what happens when you see this from an outsider's perspective? Oops, did I just lose my page? So what happens when you see this from an outsider's perspective? Obviously, from an outsider's perspective, 2020 is always hindsight. However, when we look at the behavior of organizations prior to a major breach, these are some of the things we see. We see ignored alerts and scans. We see endpoints that people gave were basically were over permissioned, and nobody heeded the warnings, not only of auditors, but also of the internal security people. They ignored those transgressions by your key software engineering groups, your individuals, major executives who just didn't want to follow the rules, or even third-party relationships. And then, of course, in discovery, after a breach, everything is up for grabs. We used to call it the target rule, that the incident report was no longer a viable thing because it was considered attorney-client privilege, but that has since been bypassed by several court precedences. And what you see in that discovery review are the employees' sarcastic and painful comments about things that were going on inside the organization, how everyone knew how bad it was and they wouldn't do anything, complaints about the programmers, complaints about bad code, complaints about the websites and how vulnerable they are, and hope to God we don't get caught, and jokingly talking about how confidential information was in non-production environments. So what does that look like? Well, it looks really bad when they show up in those incident reports, in a newspaper, in an expert report to a judge. All that kind of culminates, and you look really bad after a breach. So what happened? What are we really finding? Now, I loved the last two presentations by both Kathy and Nilofer, because they touch on the exact same things that I'm touching on. But I want to talk about those things, those items, those cybersecurity, basic security hygiene items, from that perspective of after the book is closed, all the damage has been done, somebody's reading your book and they're giving you a review, okay? And in all cases, And I mean all cases, even ones that actually had very, very sophisticated nation state threat actors. Almost all of them walked through the front door at some point. That front door may be a developer, it may be a third party, maybe something, but what allowed them to persist and actually get in were basic missing pieces of standard security hygiene that's been around for a long time, and usually started with the company culture from the very beginning. And these include, and they're not all inclusive, but these are the top: minimal or no continuous asset management and identification, lack of access management, lack of network segmentation, inadequate logging and monitoring, and a non-functional IR plan. And I'll go into what non-functional means here in a little bit. And the bottom line is when things actually get fixed or when companies are actually running smoothly, it doesn't mean they're not going to get hacked. It doesn't mean they're not going to have a compromise. But what it does mean is it's probably not going to end up on the front page of a newspaper. The damage will be minimized. And everyone actually comes out better and more efficient by researching and finding out what happened. And they have the ability and the culture that allows them to find it and stop it right away. Cyber resilience and operational system efficiency, as well as overall efficiencies for the entire organization, in hindsight, almost always go hand in hand. So why is it so hard to do? And I haven't answered that question, but I can tell you that one of the biggest reasons is company culture. And that's something that you just can't change without certain aspects going into place. But I'm not here to be an organizational psychologist. I am not here to try and be an HR person. Okay. So you see the typical iceberg, right? Company discovers the tip of the iceberg. That's when they realize they really had a breach. Cyber investigators come in and find just how deep and how long it went. Expert reports show that. And this is just an example, but it's not a far-fetched example. The common question I have on this is, why don't we see this in the news? Why does the company then give us their breach report and a notification that a compromise has occurred, and they only talk about that tip of the iceberg? And a lot of the reason is because the cyber investigators' scope were limited to only what was found and what they can put in the report. And that is a true universal across the board statement. I'm not sure a lot of people will admit to that, but you do have attorneys, you have compliance experts coming in and saying, nope, you're only looking at this. The only thing you found, the scope, the damages are going to be limited to that tip of the iceberg. In the meantime, discovery and what the cyber investigators really found is that they go all the way back to where the logs prevent them from going any longer. And we still rarely find patient zero of how the actual threat actors came into the organization. Trying to get my controls here. Okay. So what happens after a breach? Well, we jokingly call that all the stages of grief, right? There's epiphanies. We should have known that. There's a lot of face palming. There's a lot of blaming, and there's a lot of claims of we were a victim. I have never seen one organization truly be a victim. I've seen their customers and their supply chain be victimized, but limited as far as the definition of what a victim is. And overall, some people get fired. Now, in the Equifax breach that I wrote a declaration on, the first person they fired was the security guy or the operational SOC guy that was supposed to apply a patch. The declaration I wrote for the Supreme Court of Georgia was actually put in the Washington Post, as well as the New York Times and a few other places. That was not the cause of that breach. That was the cause of what helped them discover the breach. So let's take it to the next step. You get done with the epiphanies. Then everyone looks at all the outgoing and ongoing and canceled and non-budgeted projects that should have been done in order to prevent what they saw. And all of a sudden, budget's no longer an issue. Okay. Deprecating and replacing older systems that have been around for almost a decade and people have been arguing about for years, and projects start and get canceled and they just don't want to dedicate the resources, get fixed in less than 30 days. And when we go through and get the discovery of the emails and the documentation and the multiple PowerPoint presentations to the board, what you find is those 30 days occurred almost painlessly and not even as expensive as they thought it was, after close to 5 years of arguing about it. So it reminds me of, if you have kids at home and you tell them to take out the garbage or mow the lawn, and they argue with you and they spend all their energy arguing, and they could have spent their energy and already completed the task. All of a sudden, after a breach, the board is paying really close attention to cyber. They're paying a lot of attention to cyber. Now that wanes by far, the farther away the actual event of the breach goes. And also afterwards, you have a lot of very, very broadly scoped audits. That also will wane after a couple years after the breach is announced. Overall, the company actually produces a better product, a better service. The training of the employees becomes very functional. It becomes part of the normal course of business, at least for a short run. And, they actually experience more efficient operational activities. The company actually pays less money per transaction going forward. Now, the big bang effect of having to fix all these cyber issues is very costly to them. Obviously, the pain of having to pay out a class action lawsuit per customer can be very, very costly. The cost of the law firms involved, they really take a large bulk of that. Okay, that becomes very costly. But if you take the variable costs that are only related to the breach out of the picture, a couple years after the breach occurs and all these fixes took place, they actually saved money. And they put all the basics in place. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about whether those basics actually survive once they become complacent again. But basically, the journey itself to do those 30 days or even a couple months worth of fixes that they spent millions on arguing about for 5 years, was unnecessary. But unfortunately, that's what it took to get them. And when I say 2 years, that's the average time we see organizations returning to the culture of pre-breach, because it's still not in the forefront of their mind, even though the consumer class action may actually not be decided by the courts until about 2 years after the breach. That activity at the executive level, that activity with the lawyers, that activity in the courts is not really communicated back down to the normal operating units, whether they be IT, cyber, or anything like that within the organization. They're completely numb to what's going on and they're non-informed. So by the time we see a lot of injunctive relief activities occurring from the courts, they're way beyond that. And they've gone back to the normal course of business because nothing's happened in the past 2 years. So why are we going to worry about it? And what I want to do through this presentation is try to work with people to say, okay, nothing's happened, but that doesn't mean you couldn't be back in that same boat again. Look at T-Mobile. Okay. So what happened leading up to the breach? We already talked about this. Budget investment didn't prioritize security. Compliance is minimum. It was to meet the bare minimum of what I call paring the hole of the actual requirement. And there was no consistent enforcement of any of the basic security hygiene. I'm not saying it was non-existent, and probably maybe 2 or 3 cases in smaller departments, it was non-existent in some of my experiences over the past 10 years. But for the most part, it was inconsistent. And if you've ever had me come into your company and give you a lecture, the one thing that I always tell you is I would prefer organizations in general to be consistent. Even if you're consistently wrong, you can fix it. When you're inconsistent, that's when you really can't determine what an anomaly is. So you have to be consistent. Even if it's the lowest level of bar to be consistent, you've got to be consistent. These are actual quotes of organizations, and I only quoted from Fortune 50 organizations. So that should hopefully help ring a bell here.
So, Mary,
yes,
I had a question.
We have heard people say, well, we have that policy. We check that box. Good. Next thing. Why do I even have to read the policy? We have the policy. We satisfied the minimum requirement of the audit. We're done. Move on.
Hey, Mary, I have a question.
We have passed the pen test for the HIPAA PCI. However, we limited the scope of the IPs to the bare minimum, the ones we knew we would pass. And we knew we were doing that. But you can't get us in trouble because we satisfied the requirement. That happens a lot. Matter of fact, the majority, I would say, not the majority, I haven't had one data breach that I've come in as an incident handler or as a class action expert where they didn't pass all their audits, particularly when it comes to PCI and HIPAA. The other thing that happens is people get overly complacent about using the cloud. The cloud, no matter what cloud provider you're using, always publishes their SOC 2 Type 2 and every other type of audit. And people think if I use that cloud and they're already SOC 2 Type 2, then I don't have to do any type of due diligence myself. So we're good. About security, this happens, and we see this all the time in emails coming up. Those security guys, they're annoying, they're paranoid, they don't know what they're doing, they don't understand my job, they keep me from doing my job. That's an actual quote from a Fortune 10 CTO. And then this actually happened from the same Fortune 10 CTO in the past year. And the quote was, if you don't open up those ports, and this is to their CISO, I'm going to send my entire software engineering team to Starbucks to work. And it was implied I'll do it on an open network. That is a Fortune 10 CTO. The other thing that we see is over-reliance on tools and third parties. Matter of fact, when we come into organizations, we see a plethora of tools. The board, executive management is very, very just cost weary of adding another tool. They don't want to add another tool. What people don't realize is each tool you add is actually another attack vector. And a lot of those tools, in hindsight and during a forensic examination, turned out that they were actually weaponized against the organization. Another thing that we see is a lot of SIMs installed in the same company. There's no correlation. There's minimal ingestion. They only want to use the log aggregation and correlation on certain areas of production environments that were actually identified in the risk registry of the risk assessment. So I absolutely love Kathy's, comments about, and the questions that came through on the risk registry and its actual usefulness and how you make it useful. The other thing that we see is lack of systematic enforcement. The policies are in place, but they're not systematically enforced, meaning that particularly people with elevated privileges often move around them quite a bit. My personal favorite is the comments. Again, these are from large companies where the CTO or the CIO simply says, yes, everyone on my team needs full access to production in order to support the customer. How dare you not give that to us? Don't put any gateways in there. It will cause customer service to suffer. We won't be able to do what we need, et cetera. The other thing that we see a lot of is that security training and policies are present. They're required to be present, but they're considered a necessary evil. So people go through the security training, but the actual day-to-day enforcement of that security training simply isn't there. And then, and as I've mentioned before, that audit piece, the audits, when the organizations get to pick and choose the controls, get to pick and choose what is actually shown to the auditor, is they're vastly under scope. And then after there are findings are temporarily fixed. In most of the major data breaches that I've been involved in, we would see that there would be temporary fixes into the audit findings, and those temporary fixes would then just revert back and they'd fix them again before the next audit, but it wasn't consistent. They were not systematically enforced. So basically, what I'm saying here is that just about every single, I should say just about everyone actually, violation or security incident started with this basic lack of security hygiene. Security hygiene that we have heard about and has been in just about every single presentation since security, cybersecurity, information security actually became a thing. The other thing is that the foundation of the organizational culture that actually allowed that to happen. Hindsight's always 2020. And when we go back into service desk logs, we go back into the actual event logs, we almost always see the signs of that threat actor or multiple threat actors being in the environment. But because a lot of your SOC individuals are overwhelmed, there's limited resources, and they're also only going to security people, not to the people who are running the systems, supporting the systems that the alert's being generated on. So then you take somebody who has IT experience normally because they're in security, but they're not working in the everyday life of the individual, of the service desk, people that are not the security and see the patterns. A lot of them are not working in the actual IT developers area, which would be a much better reflection of how to interpret that particular alert. Or there's been so many policy violations that they just become background noise and they're ignored. But I haven't met one where the signs weren't there. And I want to emphasize that, hindsight's always 2020. And when you're coming in as a third party and looking at this from an unbiased, non-tribal knowledge aspect, they stick out like red flags. And that's not good. Also, the most successful long-running breaches, and we've never had a ransomware incident that actually started with a ransomware. It usually started because the ransomware attackers actually bought access into the organization because they had already been fully compromised prior to that. But it was basically caused by basic lack of human judgment that was historically precedented over a long time. And that includes and is it's qualified by lack of qualified resources and sometimes even basic lack of curiosity. A major event that I was deposed on recently came from an event that had actually been long going, and there were services running, showing up in the event logs, and the services looked like they were being blocked, but nobody had started those services. Nobody knew what they were. Okay. And everyone lacked the curiosity to figure out why all these programs were attempting to run in their organization. They just said, oh, must be a fluke, right? Because it looks like it wasn't run successfully, so we're just going to ignore it. Nobody looked at how they actually got in and why that thing was running. And if they had done that the first time they saw it, they would have saved over 2 years of data being exfilled from their organization. Okay, John, I'm not sure if you want me to answer the questions you're putting in the chat on.
Sure. I was wondering if you could hear me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's you brought up a bunch of great points about the auditing and pen testing and in my experience, pen testers usually ask for admin accounts to test against, and that seems to be a little bit unrealistic. And then on the flip side, application owners will give the least privileged accounts for pen testing. Is there some happy medium? Is there a way of managing that so you get a true representation of what the risks are in an application?
So one of the reasons why pen testers will ask for admin privileges or similar elevated privileges is because they're trying to emulate an attacker after they've already gained access, and what they can do, what's picking it up, what's going to stop them from doing things that are causing anomalies in the system or basically attacking the system. We've talked a little bit about MITRE. And if anyone knows Dr. Stanley Barr at MITRE, they're actually working on MITRE Engage. And MITRE Engage is a whole nother framework within MITRE that's saying, hey, just assume you've already been attacked. Don't look for that attack coming in from an ingress port. And if you can't find it, they're just dismissing anomalies that are happening within your network. Assume somebody's already in your network and act that way. So when we come in to do a pen test, for instance, we are coming in and saying, I'm assuming your credentials have already been harvested. What's going to happen if I do this? Do you have enough network segmentation in place that prevents me from just traversing the network? And, the bottom line is with most ransomware attacks, they come in as a developer, as an IT support person with already admin privileges. And then they're able to basically traverse the entire network almost on every single endpoint undetected. So how would you stop a ransomware person that bought access from another threat actor, particularly from threat actors involved in various APTs?
Okay, that's great. Great answer. Thank you.
So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of break down each one of the areas I just spoke about. That was the cyber hygiene basic missed points. And I'm going to talk about it in the term of what was going on in those organizations before the breach was discovered, and then what the cyber investigation found. Now, this is not all inclusive. They're just some high-level talk points. And Nilofer talked about this quite a bit. And then the concept of asset management and how you do continuous asset management was already discussed by Kathy. So before the breach was discovered, what we find is that asset management log monitoring was incredibly limited to only those areas that people thought were critical because of the risk registry. They didn't get a baseline for everything. They also only did production, and they only covered the area required by certain compliance frameworks such as PCI or HIPAA. They completely ignored non-production. Okay. And also the asset management itself did not include universal or enterprise level security appliances, infrastructure operational services, the container environment, the CI/CD pipeline for the developers, and the general developer tools. They were considered out of scope. We don't need that. Minimal security policies were ever applied to non-production environments. Now, granted, you need a lot more open access in non-production environment. You can't necessarily realistically lock down a lot of developers, but that doesn't mean you don't monitor them. That doesn't mean you don't compare configuration standards and changes. If I'm a mouse during the winter, and by the way, I'm not really based out of Los Angeles. I just happen to be in Los Angeles this week at our office. I'm actually based out of the tundra, which I also affectionately call Minneapolis. During this time of year, mice or voles are trying to get in your house. They're not going to get into just the kitchen. They get into any hole they can find in your house to stay warm for the winter. And then they slowly migrate their way to the sources of food. And that's what you need to look at your organizations like. And the easiest way to get in there is through people who are not locked down, assets that aren't managed, and non-production environments. That's walking in through the front door for most of these. The other thing that I see all the time, and I know that there's a lot of controversy about, is no software bill of materials. In addition to that, there's a lack of inventory of APIs that are being used. There's minimal configuration baselines or validations. Software engineers, and I think Kathy and Nilifer covered this, is they often expose a lot of information that should be considered secure and not public information within not only web applications, but also within those APIs. And a lot of times they do hard code credentials, and we see service buses with hard coded credentials running in the clear all the time. And your developers, particularly your contract developers during the pandemic working from home, were actually coding in public repositories and sharing code. Now, we go in as threat intelligence people and scrape that stuff all the time. And you'd be surprised what we see, because they're going for speed and trying to get product out the door. They're not going for security. And if they're not within your organizational environment, you can't stand them anyways. But the fact that they're allowed to do it is a whole nother story. So we can go through Pastebin, GitHub, Slack, Stack Overflow, a ton of different repositories that particular developers like to use, and they give away the farm with their organizations. The other thing that we see is that because we're not monitoring non-production, that anything that happens in non-production is dismissed as a false positive or somebody just learning something or whatever. I think it was Nilifer that talked about the ability for certain APIs that are in the public to allow people to actually have access and use those APIs to crawl and query databases. Well, guess what? Your production and test databases, even if you don't have confidential information in there, are the exact same scheme and structure as your production. So you're training somebody on what to do very, very fast once they do get access to production. And that happens a lot more. And that has actually been about a 60% root cause for how the speed of a more sophisticated attacker was able to get into the organization and get to what we call the crown jewels very, very fast. So in the cyber investigation, what we find when people don't have enterprise level continuous asset management, we see a ton of things, but mostly you can boil this down into surprises. They really didn't know what they had. They didn't even know what was in their production environment until they had this incident and they had to bring in third parties to go in and do an analysis. And by the way, there was no cleanup. I mean, there was RMM agents that were 5-10 years old and highly vulnerable. There were VNets that were completely wide open, virtual machines that were completely exposed, had external IPs, security appliances and other infrastructure appliances that didn't even know were there, a ton of legacy old assets, software that had never been truly deprecated from the environment. And usually what we see buried in there are malicious web shells. Malicious web shells on assets that weren't being managed because they weren't considered part of the critical infrastructure, the production infrastructure that was mentioned in the risk assessment or the risk registry. And they were beaconing out to a ton of malicious IPs and had been doing so for some time. And if you've ever had to look at the log history of a web server, it's incredibly informative. There were tons of warnings and errors, but they were dismissed, not collected, or not reviewed. there are usually multiple vulnerabilities in the cloud, on web app servers, on jump servers, on Bastion hosts, things that were completely missing. One of the things that I mentioned in here is that some of the areas that are not asset managed are building automation systems. They got access to your entire network. They got access to every building in your campus and sometimes across multiple geographic regions. In one really, really large company in California, they still had the default password on that. It wasn't even included in any asset management, tagging, logging, or monitoring. We also see the same thing happen with UPS devices, printers, especially printers that are serviced from, let's say, your third-party printer provider. In one case, which was really bad, they hadn't really performed any type of security scanning of the APIs that they were using, and they had actually delivered agents down to their customers. And the APIs had a malicious URL redirect that had been stealing credit card information from every single customer they had in the United States for over 2 years. And that was completely missed. They were never part of their asset management program, if one did exist. So basic cyber hygiene, your typical thing, you can't protect what you don't know you have. The last thing you want is to have a third-party person come in and find things that you had no idea were in your environment. So from here on out, you're going to see a lot of repetition, okay? Endpoint management, which is part of access management. There are a lot of organizations that are very, very fast. Their CI/CD pipelines are releasing new changes into production 5,000 times a day, okay? And they want their developers, they want their marketing people, they want everybody in the organization to not be inhibited. So they tend to approve elevated privileges and local admin rights just by default. They have extremely liberal BYOD policies. They want to do whatever they can to ensure revenue streams. Now, what we also see in this is a lot of complaints and a lot of issues and a lot of bugs in software that's found, because as they're releasing things so fast and they don't really have a good baseline, they're stepping on each other. Somebody releases change that totally negates or compromises change or even legacy code. We also see the liberal BYOD policy with huge attack vectors, with people having absolutely no limits on how they're using their corporate assets. Non-work related browsing, social media, basically a wide variety of personal use. Now, a lot of IT security people would say, no. We put those policies in place so they can't do that. But they don't systematically block that activity. And when an executive wants to get onto a Black Friday shopping site, no one's going to tell them no. And guess what? A lot of your phishing exploits come from capitalizing on that behavior. So when all those alerts start coming through to the SOC, the IT help desk or anybody like that, they get overwhelmed and they miss the forest for the trees. And we saw in hindsight, multiple complaints of endpoint issues, multiple complaints of realistic credentials being compromised, even with MFA turned on, which means that they had MFA bypass mechanisms. Okay. So the cyber investigation findings, when they've had their major breach that they need to bring in third parties for, and they need to start announcing to their customers, this type of behavior often emanates in persistent LSAS running on mobile devices. So in other words, there was keyloggers galore, memory scrapers galore, and trying to find how those got on there is like looking through a Dostoevsky novel and trying to figure out which each character was doing for the last 20 years of their life. there were minimal alert that did not indicate these compromises were happening. But because the IT service desk or the SOC was already overwhelmed, they were looking at them in a vacuum and they were dismissed as false positives. Threat actors had compromised multiple vectors for many years. And what we often ignore in this is the use of mobile devices and MDM not being enforced or not being configured correctly, because that's also one of the attack vectors they get in when people are actually doing work from their mobile devices that aren't registered or managed by the organization. By the time it's gotten this bad, we're never going to find the initial point of entry, and the IOCs are overwhelming. So the bottom line here is consistency. Consistent systemic control of endpoints. And that is a basic cyber hygiene principle that's been around for a long time. And again, I'd rather have people be consistently wrong than inconsistent, because the inconsistency is really what overwhelms the people that are trying to protect the company and review all those alerts. So general access management, which is a continuation of the endpoint management, we still see this a lot. There's a ton of shared accounts, a ton of email forwarding allowed, no admin account review or review of changing credentials. And this kind of goes with the default to just allowing those elevated privileges, and then having so many of them, they can't really review them anyways for anomalies. Another thing that we found after the fact was multiple instances of hard-coded credentials, hard-coded SSH certs, service calls, back-end service buses with hard-coded credentials in them, wikis in Microsoft Teams and Slack, where they were passing these hard-coded credentials back in clear text. No use of a consistent vault, and when the vault was used, it was only used for production environments that needed to call the vault on demand. MFA was not enabled internally. For external access, for people coming in or customers coming in, it was turned on. Internally, it was not. So again, once a threat actor got in there, they had full reign. They could go wherever they wanted, and there was no checks and balances. A lot of times software engineers build in backdoors to systems and fail to take them out when they get moved into production. And we find a ton of those in production. When these alerts go off and there's strange activity, like I mentioned with some of those service executables and DLLs trying to actually execute, and it makes it in the Windows event logs in that particular instance were making it look like they weren't successful, even though they were. We see these described as flukes. There are no flukes. This is a computer. It does what we tell it to do. It doesn't react differently when the weather's different. It doesn't accidentally drop anything. And those flukes form a pattern. And with competing SIMs that I'm going to talk about in the last section here, they fail to find them because you don't have true correlation. So proper configuration of the tools would have determined the pattern of alerts that were happening and would have immediately told you this isn't a fluke, but they missed it. So afterwards, when we see this type of access management actually occurring, again, we see a rampant number of web shells. We see harvested administrative accounts that have been harvested for a long time. We see that those bypass mechanisms were routinely used by the threat actors. Matter of fact, the threat actors are using your own tools against you. We see fileless malware, and we see configuration changes that were not caught. and clear implementation of things like a Chrome browser executable being placed on a server where it shouldn't have been, or even on a domain controller, and nobody caught it because that domain controller was not in production at the time. So again, no consistent systemic enterprise access control. Network security segmentation. There really isn't a ransomware that would be successful without correctly configured network segmentation. Once a threat actor gets into the organization through whatever means possible, if there is a blind or implied trust within the organization, that means that a threat actor can move unimpeded. And what you really want is kind of like the concept of that old Roach Motel commercial where roaches get in, but they can't get out. You want that defense in depth, and you don't really have to focus on creating a very large program just to focus on defense in depth, because it's embedded with your network segmentation if it's done right. So we see that open between VNets and between instances. And as you saw with the Capital One data breach, which I was part of, that implied trust within the AWS services. So basically, once they get in, they get assumed to be a trusted attribute, a trusted entity, and then follow through your entire organization and egress data out as a trusted entity. So we see that convenience of moving smoothly within the organization, really overriding any type of network segmentation. And that's further enabled by cultural fiefdoms within the organization. So everyone's looking at what's good for them and their department and their division, but not necessarily over the entire network. And what also gets missed in that are those appliances that are applied throughout the entire network. They get used against them also. So cyber investigation findings after a breach is discovered, yeah, those threat actors owned you. Even if we can't publicly state it, they owned the entire organization. We found very few pieces that weren't touched. They weaponized their own infrastructure against them. They, of course, had already performed very advanced or even script kiddie level credential harvesting. And the majority of them came in through non-production systems and networks, areas where your crown jewels weren't, and then jumped over into the areas that they were located. I'm seeing, and I've always seen a huge use of remote desktop protocol, completely open and used by just about everyone, including IT support, to jump through the network. Well, that is then utilized by the threat actors, and very successfully. Matter of fact, every single major breach involved unprotected RDP protocol. So basic cyber hygiene, implement external and internal network segmentation, and be consistent in your architectural standards for the implementation of that network segmentation. Logging and monitoring, that's huge. And obviously, it's a culmination of everything we already talked about. Okay. So if logging and monitoring had been universal in order to establish a baseline, a lot of the alerts would not have been dismissed summarily. Okay. But to log and monitor the areas where the crown jewels are located, the production instances containing confidential information, subject to PCI or HIPAA compliance or even CMMC. We're only going to log and monitor that, and we only want to log and monitor for certain events. Well, when you take those events and you only log and monitor for those types of events out of context, you actually lose the story. It's nothing more than taking a title from a major periodical, putting a few key words in there, but then putting the meat of what really happened, which may contradict the title of that story. Your logging and monitoring is only seeing the title. The other thing is when you do have large organizations and they have what we call cultural fiefdoms, a lot of times they have multiple SIMs, which totally negates the ability to be able to determine if an enterprise-wide tool has actually been weaponized against you, which happens a lot. So with those fiefdoms, you have lack of correlation and you have lack of file integrity monitoring when it goes in between those fiefdoms. You have external warnings that come in. Matter of fact, the last large 10 breaches that we worked at had warnings from the FBI, they had warnings from the Secret Service, they had threat intelligence reports coming in from the third parties. And what happened was they were coming in saying, hey, we think this is going on in your organization. But when the internal security team went in to actually investigate, they weren't logging and monitoring everything, and they couldn't see that it was actually successful or is really going on. So they dismissed the warnings. And those warnings turned out to be 100% accurate. The other thing that we see is that, going back to my initial statement, is that the logging and monitoring is really only used for security when it actually benefits the entire organization. So in the investigations, most of the time, the negligence comes from the company being woefully inadequate to actually handle today's threats from the lack of logging and monitoring. They can't find the IOCs. There is a total rat infestation. Usually it starts on non-cardholder environments, non-PHI environments, and they're undetected due to lack of monitoring and logging, and then misconfigured security appliances that are then weaponized against them that are never found because of the lack of logging and monitoring. We've also seen this consistently for about the last 10 years, is that when the threat actors do get in, they actually use your security tools and run unauthorized scans using your own tools against you, and then capitalizing on the vulnerabilities that are found. Those some of the vulnerabilities that never make it up to the higher critical area with their typical vulnerability scans because they're not in critical areas. So logging and monitoring everything to detect baseline anomalies. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of questions on that one too. In the incident response plan, I can summarize this entire screen by saying that they didn't have a functional incident response plan. The incident response plan was limited to the tabletop testing, which is the basic requirement for cyber insurance. It's a basic requirement for a SOC 2. It's a basic requirement for a lot of them. And in a tabletop, you often have more executive leaders and not enough of the doers in the room actually doing it. The policies and procedures are beautiful. They checked all the boxes. However, no one was using them and nobody was auditing to their own compliance against them. And then when they actually do get sued, their actual policies are used against them. Test scenarios in the incident response plan are often negated or thrown out because certain pockets of IT or the executives have a level of overconfidence in their system and don't think they need to test for these really basic things. And then when something happens in a tabletop exercise that's critical to the organization, there's an executive tendency to kill the messenger, that we're not doing this well. Therefore, we need to blame somebody. And so people become very afraid of speaking the truth in those meetings. So after the finding, there's a massive confused political response to an incident that's found. They're really not prepared. There's a political push to prematurely announce the root cause so they can get regulators customers, et cetera, off their backs, the board off their backs, and that results in soiled artifacts, limited use of out of band in order to get the communications out, which means those communications about what was really going on can actually be exposed in discovery. And we usually find, actually, we've always found that the breach that actually hit that top of the iceberg was not their first breach. Matter of fact, it was somebody, one of the threat actors, making a serious mistake and becoming found. And obviously with ransomware, that is the end game. They're going to be found. Well, not the actual ransomware attackers necessarily, but the breach is going to be found. More sophisticated threat actors attempt to be a little bit more stealthy. And then, of course, we have lack of documented configurations and unknown baselines. So the ability to contain that particular incident is elongated beyond a normal stance. So the IR plan must be functional. So in conclusion, threat actors do walk through the front door. And they walk through the front door because of that lack of basic security hygiene. However, the organizations that we've audited and we've worked with that have made a policy of implementing and enforcing basic cyber practices actually are a lot more cost efficient, a lot more cost efficient. They adapt to change faster, and employee recruiting and retention in this market is a lot easier for them. So I'll take questions.
Hey, Mary, I actually have a question. And phenomenal presentation, because I can think of a half a dozen companies off the top of my head that I've seen that have at least one or two of these factors that play. And it's mind-boggling, because like you said, a lot of this is just basic hygiene. So the question I have is about in the incident response, or actually in your defense plans. A lot of folks pay for threat intelligence, and they get in the threat intelligence, they get the TTPs and the IOCs that are expected, but they also get a lot about the threat actors that are up and coming. Is it how knowledgeable or how useful is it to know the threat actor versus just knowing the TTPs and IOCs?
Well, each threat actor has different types of motivations, and those motivations help you determine their method of entry and what type of attack vector they're really going to use. I've always told people that the more advanced threat actors will break into your kid's phone, do mind, Roblox, one of those things, and then send you a picture and then start to get in that way. And that's exactly how we've done it in some of our security posture assessments when we have permission to do so. So the motivation, the sophistication of the threat actor, if we're talking about a nation state, basically when you're on the blue team side, you're playing whack-a-mole. They have unlimited resources, etc. They can get into you 3 ways Sunday. That's when you say, listen, I really want to focus on that resiliency. I want to create those traps through my network segmentation. I want to make sure that I've got a good enough set of tools that are coordinated and correlated so I can start seeing patterns and that type of information. And then instead of taking the threat intelligence information directly from, let's say, your threat intelligence providers, whatever type of organization or service that you actually comply with, convert that threat intelligence information into what I call the language of the CFO. Because you're going to get deer in headlights when you try to explain the motivations. What they're going to be looking at is how much is this going to cost us in reputational integrity or in bottom line if we fall victim for this? And what can we do and how much money is it worth spending to prevent and detect, or just detect and then prevent or block? And that's a good conversation to have. And that also gives the board and your executive management that is non-technical a lot more power. They feel empowered with that type of information and the ability to have that type of control over the risk. Does that help?
No, that's great, great information. We actually have a question from Ken Kempster. Ken, speak it out loud if you want?
Sure, sure. Thank you, John. Yeah, just some questions. Just a question around the bullet point concerning recruiting. Now, I think I got the gist of internal retention, if you will, when it comes to your existing employee base, where okay, we're not jumping it from post to pillar all the time with cyber hygiene and cyber baseline type stuff because we have a much more well-oiled machine, if you will, internally, but externally from a recruiting point of view, how do you see that in increasing your capabilities to recruit new talent and increase the bench?
This is a very small market and people talk. And if your security people, your SOC analysts, or your IT people are in a flea in the jar syndrome where they've tried to, talk about what's wrong in the organization and they keep getting shot down, that spreads pretty rapidly through the industry. When you have a healthy culture where as long as you can back up what you're saying and you stay on task, but you're listened to, you're valued, and people take the security and the compliance seriously, people want to work for you. They will spread the word. Your existing employees will spread the word in various contexts at conferences and online venues. You become the company people want to work for.
Thank you. Now that clears it up. I definitely agree that the culture component of it does definitely, I guess, entice people to talk positively about their organization and want to recruit, talent that they know of that they've worked with in the past and want to bring them in and basically, we're building a team. Would you be interested in joining, kind of thing?
The other thing is you got to pay close attention to what's going on in the courts right now with CISOs being charged criminally and civilly directly with failure to protect the organization. Nobody wants to be associated with a company that's become a security risk, especially if you work in security. That reflects on your career and on your reputation. So people will start to leave when they see stuff going on that they think it's only a matter of time before you get caught or before a breach is discovered and becomes public. They start looking.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Capital One, I guess you're lucky if you only get fired as opposed to actually getting sued on top of it.
You'd be surprised how many people prefer to be fired over stay with an organization that's gone through that.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, Mary, our time's up. So thank you so much for this. I love this. I saw you sent me a PDF of this presentation, if that's allowable to be shared, because I'm going to share this with like I said, the 6 companies that I talk with on a regular basis, because it's so important. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.